How's everyone doing tonight?
Down in the right top-right corner.
I am from Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin. This is actually a photo from my hometown, right on Main Street Bridge. A specialty I like to think of myself as a long exposure photographer. About 85% of what I do is long exposure. Whether it be sunrises, sunsets, any scenes throughout the day, also a lot of astrophotography. It's crazy the amount of different options you can do with long exposure photography as long as you have a 10 stop, anywhere from a 4 stop to a 10 stop. My favorite filter that I do have is a 10 stop. That's my most used filter. The shot itself was shot with a 10 stop. Always normally in the day I'm shooting an f/22 normally, which is kind of strange. People look at me kind of funny for that all the time, but I'm trying to block out.
You want a chair to sit on back there?
Yeah, you look like you're gonna break it.
I'm tall, I know.
He's young, he's back and handle it.
That, besides car rides, I cannot handle car rides. Too much slouch in my whole life. So this symbol itself, though, is very important for Fort Atkinson. It's right on the Riverwalk. It's actually Chief Black Hawk, so I made sure to put that into the composition itself. It's an image that I wanted Fort Atkinson to be able to use for the community for their Instagram. So it's pretty important, and it's definitely a place that I really enjoy photographing since it's right out my back door. It's just I go downtown and shoot there a lot. This is again the same place right downtown, just right down the stairs. This was a sunrise. Almost all sunrises that I shoot, I get there at blue hour and I don't put an ND filter on. But from that point, I'm using a sturdy tripod and I'm shooting long exposures about up until maybe 5 minutes before the sun actually breaks. And a lot of times I'll put on an ND filter about 5 to 10 minutes prior, change the lens, and that's how I'll continue shooting long exposures. Because I mean, if you get there early enough in blue hour, you're able to actually crank out good 3 to 4 minute long exposures at f/16, f/22. You just have to be there early enough before a lot of light comes. But you can actually get some pretty awesome stuff though, even when it's clear, because you'll get the stars and the dawn coming up. I've done a few images like that over the lakes, you're getting both. This was actually from a trip to Devil's Lake we took, and I challenged myself the entire trip to shoot in long exposure format, which it is kind of a strenuous hike up there in general, but I brought my tripod with, stopped along the entire way. I probably took a good 400 pictures, even in long exposure. This one was special to me because I caught a lot of movement on top of the rocks. We had rock climbers actually on the rock itself. So I thought if I did a long enough exposure, you can kind of see her movement up and down on top. I'm catching ghosts up there, which that was pretty neat. So you never know what you're going to find when you get up there, because it is a lot of rock climbers at Devil's Lake. But that was a fun experience. That was in the fall. Again, I've only been shooting for about 2 years, so a lot of these images are from my first year of photography in general. I probably 3 or 4 months into shooting is when I started with long exposure. I always liked the effects I saw on Facebook on master landscapes and stuff like that, and it's just something I wanted to get into, but filter systems were so expensive and it just wasn't something I could really put into, so I eventually got a screw-on filter, and that's when everything picked up. I fell in love immediately and I just kept on going with it. And sometimes I take it a little bit far. For example, I mean, this is a 16 stopper, so you can get as far as 16 stops, and those are used for eclipses. And I mean, you can crank out as much as 25, 30-minute exposures. And this was Lake Michigan, and it was an incredibly wavy day. But because of the fact I shot for about 16 minutes on this exposure, the entire image is just calm. I mean, and you can actually see me in multiple places in this image too. There's a shadow of me here, shadow of me here, shadow of me here. That's one of my trademarks that I put into my images to kind of give my viewers a vocal point or a focal point of me so they know who I am all the time. I thought that was kind of I know people do it in general, but I try to do it a lot, just so people, when they see my face, they recognize me. And not from that, no. Not from that. But
they recognize your work, you mean?
Yes, in general. People, I get so many questions from people with with me being transparent. And is that a goal? I can't tell you how many questions I get when you post that online. People get confused. A lot of people do not understand long exposure. And I mean, you'll get into arguments with people when you're doing landscape work with waterfalls, whether or not somebody wants the natural look to the water itself, or you want that smooth, silky look. And I mean, that's all personal preference. I like the more artistic look of long exposure. So everybody's got their point of view when it comes to this. I personally like the artistic and abstract designs that long exposure creates. And it allows you to get very creative yourself. These were all on 7 bridges in Milwaukee, South Milwaukee. It's a really fun place, I think, to shoot. Doesn't matter day or night. This early morning, for example, I believe this was 3.5, 4 minute long exposure, which led to the entire milkiness of the water itself. I really fell in love with the ice sculptures. That was going to be my main focal point. You don't see stuff like that very often, and it's funny when you have a wide angle lens and you bring it down real close, you can create mini little landscapes in a big photo. And that's fun to do. I tend to get very low to the ground with my landscapes. That's something that having a 14 millimeter lens or a 12 millimeter lens gives you the opportunity to do. It gives you a different viewpoint. And it's nice too having an articulating screen, for when I don't have my tripod, I can actually get very low and be steady. That all depends on if you're going to have stabilization in your lens and your camera body. I personally have the Canon EOS R. There is no stabilization. So that's all on me for the most part. And my lens, my 14-24 Sigma has stabilization. My 85 millimeter f1.4 does not, and the 70-200 Sigma does have. So I know the new one they're coming out with right now, the R5, is going to be the first Canon body that actually introduced in-body stabilization, I think up to like 5 or 6 stops. So it's a pretty big jump up for what they have right now. So I'm looking forward to that. Let's move on. Madison, it's a shot that we've seen shot so many times, and you see it on Wisconsin Photographers or other group pages, and trying to make your image while shooting this is very difficult to stand out. I see a lot of people shoot it with fireworks. I'm very sad that they're not doing Shake the Lake anymore, because Shake the Lake is probably the most impressive place to be able to shoot the actual cityscape of Madison. But the best place, in my opinion, that's public to shoot this, and where I shot it, is Olin Park, right off John Olin Drive. And I mean, you can get some pretty good views of the Capitol itself from there. And shooting at night, it is one of my favorite cityscapes to shoot. It's got a very beautiful look to it and a reflection. And I usually vary when I'm shooting scenes like this, anywhere from f22 to f8, depending on how long I want the exposure to be, and if I want to get the sunburst or the starburst and the lights, which I think that's a stylistic thing that also causes a lot of questions of people. I think I answer that question more than anything is, do you add that in Photoshop? And obviously, if you understand diffraction, how your lens works, that's how you get your sunburst, f22, f16, f22, which I enjoy that too. Which I bring that into photographing Christmas lights. This last year was my first year of actually photographing Christmas lights and actually trying to do a proper job at it. We went to the Rotary Gardens in Janesville, and I thought this scene lit up just looking like stars and Santa flying off to the stars. And that all happened because I shot at f22. So giving all of those bursts into the sky, giving the resemblance of stars. And that was more of an artistic choice. I mean, I could have shot it at f2.8 and it would have just been balls, but it's not as intriguing to look at if it would have been shot that style. So I made sure to bring my tripod with, probably held up a bunch of people in line throughout the walking just by shooting, but it's kind of cool though, because with these shots, for example, I was shooting near a minute long, and I was even doing pathway shots, and because of that fact, people were moving through my shot, but none of them would actually show up because everybody was constantly moving. So I would get perfectly clear shots of landscape that was there without any people. So that's another benefit of shooting long exposure in general. You kind of erase traffic of people.
On a shot like this, if it were windy, you would have had a problem.
Yeah, we got very lucky with the day that we went because there was no wind. And I mean, that's a very big challenge as doing long exposure. You don't want movement in your image. image. So you really have to judge the days that you're going to be doing this. Especially if you have trees in the frame or anything like that. I mean, you can have the most perfect cloud movement, but then your framing of trees around the entire image itself is going to be blurry and it's going to throw off the entire image. So you really have to be kind of conscientious of the weather itself when you're shooting long exposures. And yes, this day got extremely lucky. There was absolutely no wind. It was perfect. Same with that. It just creates such interesting scenes. And I mean, a lot of that's created with editing as well, obviously, Lightroom, pulling back highlights and everything else. But it's interesting. I fell in love with it. I mean, the shots that I would take handheld shooting Christmas lights, in my opinion, were nothing compared to putting on a tripod and shooting 30 to 60 seconds. Just the results are a lot better. So it just goes to show it can be used in so many different ways. Sunrise, this was actually the 2 days before the whole protests and riots happened in Madison. I was teaching lessons out there and we had this beautiful sunset. And this was another challenging situation where having a heavy tripod comes in handy. We were shooting from a dock, and when you're shooting on a dock, there's a little bit of movement in that dock. And I can tell you I took a lot of photos and a lot of them did not come out just from a small amount of movement. I mean, 30 seconds and it moves for 0.08 of a second, it's going to cause the entire image to be ruined. So you truly, truly, truly have to be stable. You have to have stability. And that's why a lot of people will actually put sandbags on their tripods to just even give it more weight, especially if it's windy. So you really have to be conscientious of that. My favorite forms are definitely when you've got a lot of cloud movement, and I like to go above and beyond. Once you get past about 3.5, 4 minutes, things start to look so abstract to the point where it does not look like reality anymore. And I think that's one of those things that I love about it the most, because you can turn a scene that you're seeing in your eyes, but capturing that entire moment of time. And that's all right there in front of you. And to me, that's cool. And especially it's helped me with my patience, because when I was younger, I had a horrible patience level. And once I started doing this, it started teaching me, it's like, the longer I go, the better results I'm going to get. I mean, that's not always the case, obviously. It just depends on the weather conditions that you're at. But if you're having good clouds, like partly clouds, you can get results like this. I mean, I remember looking back on my camera after I took this and just my mouth dropped. Because I mean, this was one of the maybe 4th or 5th shot that I got where I got extremely good cloud movement going away from me or coming towards me. The best images, in my opinion, with composition with long exposure is getting those long drawn out clouds. And you want them to give depth to the photograph itself, so it helps when they actually go away from the camera rather going side to side. I mean, it's okay. I like shooting on the Rock River because I get a good composition on a dock in the middle. So that's one reason that I shoot there all the time, is I can get reflections back and forth. But when I can get something like this, I like the way it looks a lot better. I think it's more appeasing to your eyes to see that rather than your eyes going back and forth. It kind of gives the dimensions to it. And this is actually out on Black Hawk Island, which is a very unique area. It's where, this too. Okay, so this is where I get into the fact where long exposure is so important for so many different aspects of photography. I mean, this was at nighttime, and I didn't even use a tripod for this. I just propped up my camera with my wallet, pulled my wallet out, put my lens on my wallet itself, and kind of aimed down, because I wanted a very low perspective of this. And this is a glowworm. Before this, I had no idea glowworms even existed. I had no idea. I mean, I thought it was something that was made up, but sure enough, it's pitch black and you can see this thing bright as day. It just blew me away. And if I wouldn't have known to put it on f2.8, put it for like 4 seconds, I mean, that's what gave all the illumination, all that bioluminescence. Same thing if you're traveling to California and you want to shoot the bioluminescence. You're going to do that with long exposure. That's where you're going to get that movement of the blue waves, and that's how they do it. So I thought that was pretty neat, and I was happy that I kind of, in that situation, knew what I had to do in order to get the right shot. That's another, go past that. So long exposure really, it varies from long to not very long to half a second. I mean, if you're going to want to get good movement in your water, which I always experiment with this. When I got a good wavy day on Lake Koshkon or something else, I'm experimenting with my shutter constantly, whether I'm going for a half a second to an eighth of a second to 2 seconds, just seeing what the results are. And sometimes I'll even take those, shoot the same composition, and then stack those images in Photoshop to see what the result is from that too. That's also a possibility. It puts a lot of different movement into the water and everything else, and it creates even more of an abstract scene. But I really love that water movement with rocks and that focusing on rocks. I focus on rocks a lot with water because it just gives a feeling to me. And then the reflections on the sand too. I think sunsets and sunrises are by far my favorite thing. We just got back from the Bayfield cornucopia area, and we took a trip down to Lost Creek Falls, which is right outside of Cornucopia, and it was our first time there. That was a very interesting waterfall to photograph and see. It was very beautiful. The mosquitoes were absolutely horrible. And this was another place that I really varied with my exposure levels. This one was my favorite because I still maintained that translucence to the water itself, and I didn't blow out the highlights to the water. And I believe this was 8 seconds at f/16, which I just tore the highlights back a lot. I pulled those highlights back. A lot of times when I first started doing it, pretty much every waterfall I saw or did, I was shooting at about 25 to 30 seconds. And I realized that's not always the best case with waterfalls. You're gonna want, if you wanna keep some of that texture, you're gonna, even 1/2 a second, you're gonna get awesome texture on the water itself, but still smooth stuff out too. It just kind of really depends on the scene itself that you're shooting.
Hey, Spencer?
Yes.
Do you ever use a circular polarizer in conjunction with your ND?
I have not.
Because see, looking at that front rock in that last one,
Yeah.
like, ooh.
I know, trust me, that highlights in general, and it's just, it hasn't been something that I've invested in. I need to invest into a filter system for my actual 14 to 24, but I need a 150 millimeter filter system for it, and the only ones that make it, I think, are Nicey, and those are, geez, even for the starter pack, it's like $650, $700, and that doesn't even include a 10 stop. So I got to invest another $400 for the 10 stop. So someday I'll get it. I'm still shooting on my RF 24 to 105 L series, which that and the camera body took a dump in Paradise Springs about, what was it, Melissa, like 3 months after I started shooting, 3 or 4 months, something like that, and somehow came back to life. My RF lens is kind of toast. I can still work with it, but anywhere from f/14 to f/22, you can definitely tell a little bit of the water marks and damage to it. But so I just have to invest in a different filter system, which will happen, and then I'll probably be shooting a lot more because I'm not going to get the horrible marks. This was before this. Most of these pictures were actually shot with the Canon EF 17 to 40 L series, and that was an f/4, which I definitely recommend that to anybody that has a Canon. It's definitely not talked about as much as the 16 to 35 f/4 and f2.8, but it's definitely an option that gives clearly really great results. I was always happy with the color rendition and the clarity, the sharpness. As you can see, I do a lot of the same composition with my sunrises because it's close to my house, and it's, if I don't have the car, I can get there. So to me, it's the easiest, and I know it's going to look right with reflections and everything else, and it just makes my eyes happy. This was from our trip in January when we actually went up north to Bayfield. We stayed in that area again in the winter, and we stayed in Ashland, but that was our first time being at Copper Falls in the middle of winter, and we had the park completely to ourselves. It was incredible. Probably one of the best experiences I've actually gotten to have with Melissa. If you guys haven't been to that park and checked it out, I definitely recommend that to everybody. They have about 5 or 6 different waterfalls that are just perfect to take pictures of. Very luxurious. It's even better in the summer because of the smells of all the pines. I love it up there. This was a recent shot from when we were up on Cornucopia in the harbor. This was an example of when I was saying before blue hour, early blue hour, you're able to take very, very long exposures. And this was a 4.5 long exposure without using an ND filter. So there are times that you are able to do that even without an ND filter. You have a tripod, you can shoot early morning or late at night, depending. You're just not gonna be able to do the strange middle of the day cloud transformations like you would if you had a 16 stop or a 10 stop. But I make do with what I have when using that lens. This was actually from the time that my lens and camera fell in. This was pretty much my first time shooting long exposures. I got my first ND filter, got all excited, put my camera in a stream when I was shooting like an intimate stream shot and I was balancing on a log. I slipped, pushed my camera, it dumped completely in. I think I went on Wisconsin Photographers and actually talked about it, and it was about a year and 2 months ago or something like that. It was probably the most traumatic thing that after investing that much money and then having watch your baby fall, and especially after I just figured out how long exposure worked, it was pretty disheartening for me right away. But I didn't stop. I picked up a Nikon D70-100 in the meantime while that dried out, and then eventually it came back to life fully after ice and everything else. So claims to Canon for proving to get weatherproof equipment, because I didn't get anything in except my battery pack, and I had to send that back in. And I got a new one free of charge from them, so that was pretty lucky. But I got a lot of great images that day when I was at Paradise Springs. I was happy about that. My USB drive didn't break or anything like that. And I think that's what I was even more concerned about getting home, since I lose everything we just did all that time. This was another one from our trip up north. This is in Amicon Falls. This was one of my favorite places to shoot too. It was my first time visiting this state park. I had never been there before. And I fell in love with this composition just in general. It reminded me of a cup of coffee. With the way the tannins affect the water up there, it's very round. It's not as picturesque as being somewhere other, like in the East Coast or the West Coast where they got that white water, but it's still really pretty. And I think it's definitely a state's masterpiece. And a lot of different waterfalls to shoot and practice on. That's a great thing about long exposure photography too. You can constantly do it by yourself. It's not something somebody can really teach you. You just have to constantly keep on practicing and changing your settings. I mean, that's definitely the great thing about photography. It's more of a solo thing. This was during a blizzard. I mean, it was coming down like crazy, and I basically challenged myself to go out in this and be like, okay, well, can I keep my camera and lens warm enough to where it won't fog up? And this was actually 3.5 minutes on the Rock River in the middle of a blizzard. And it turned out, I mean, I got some pretty neat images from it in general, and these aren't even in monochrome. They were just so drab from the blizzard itself. So that's a fun thing too. You constantly keep on challenging yourself. This is Melissa's car. You get creative with it. And light trails. I mean, that's one thing that when I first started off, I started photographing them a lot, just trails of light in general. You can create a very interesting composition using it. A lot of leading lines. And this is one of my favorite roads to photograph. It's in our town, Banker Road, and it's a winding road, tree covered, just very beautiful. And I mean, this wasn't perfect to me at any standards. I mean, you could do a lot different ideas by going through a tunnel or something like that and setting it up, but it was just something I practiced, and I enjoyed the image itself. I know I probably won't ever sell a print of it, but it's still fun. And I think that's the great part about photography in general. It's supposed to be fun. The same thing with steel wool photography. This always seems to ruffle somebody's feathers in general because it can be dangerous in general. You have to be very cautious and careful and kind of know what you're doing. And in the beginning, I had a good idea what I was doing. It was just a very solid rainfall back there, and that's right about 10 feet over to my right-hand side is the Rock River, and this is all marshland. So everything is just soaked, drenched. Nothing caught fire. I was completely safe. But I've learned when you put it online or something like that, you really kind of have to put a point of caution to people, because there's been a lot of monuments that have been destroyed by photographers doing stupid crap like that and not taking into consideration they're doing it on old wood or something like that to start a forest fire. So it can be very dangerous. And that's actually done with steel wool and a whisk, and you light the wool on fire and you spin it around like a madman. And you can just constantly change up your spins and get completely different compositions every time. It just allows creativity the way that a light bar would. So light painting. That's just another facet of long exposure.
What caused the orange perpendicular one?
That was a spark flying extremely close to my lens. Yeah, that was probably a good maybe 1.5 foot away from the lens itself. So it's dangerous. Like I said, it's not, as you can see, I use that composition a lot, but with sunrises and sunsets, you can get away with that because every day is going to be completely different. And somebody's going to like some certain color and it's going to stick out to them, and that's what I've learned. Everybody's got their own thing that they like. So that's why I kind of continue with that. When I first started off, I did a lot of this in multiplication of myself. These are where people got very confused, where people were thinking I was doing double or triple exposures or something like that. And it wasn't the case. It was just a 1.5 minute long exposure, me moving from one spot to the other spot, and I'm quick enough moving from one spot that the camera sensor itself doesn't pick up my movement, it only picks up where I sit. So a lot of those images like this I create more for conversation starters than anything else because it makes people think, how did you do that? And again, that's the power of shooting with long exposure. If I wasn't doing that, I wouldn't be able to do any of this. It's Port Washington. It was one of my first visits, solo trips out there onto Lake Michigan. I went all the way up, I believe, to Elko and then Sturgeon Bay. It's fun to shoot on big lakes, especially long exposure. Creating such a big, massive sheet of water to be that calm just does not look natural. Whenever I see it, it does not look natural to me. And I think that's one of the things that will catch somebody's eye, seeing Lake Michigan like just flat. And I took a lot of images like that, but that one was one of my favorites because I actually had to cross out on barriers to get out to there, and that was pretty fun. Manitowoc, I got good cloud movement coming towards me. Great place to shoot that is having a nice focal point, like a lighthouse, for example. I got leading lights leading up to the lighthouse, and then me in there, which a lot of people don't even actually notice. And again, that's another transparency of me. I was kind of in a hook of doing that a lot when I took this trip. I did a lot of transparent Spencers. I've kind of eased off of doing that. Two rivers, a lot of people use jetties for long exposure. It's probably one of the most photographed forms of landscape for long exposure photography for landscape photographers. Luckily, Lake Michigan has a bunch of them. If you're on Facebook, you'll see a ton of examples in the Milwaukee area where there's a lot of jetties. This one, for example, is in Two Rivers, and it's right on the harbor. I think it's called the Harbor Trail between Two Rivers and Manitowoc. There's a lot of systems out there that are a lot of fun. I mean, parking spaces right along the lake. You can get right up to the structures. If you got light, the sunrise is right behind it. I mean, it's just you have to put yourself in the right place at the right time, which you can get some pretty awesome shots out there. When you go further up, you'll find more. I think that's the fun place too about landscape, is you're always looking for something new. Again, this was in the same beach, and you can really create a feeling with long exposure. To me, this is peace and serenity. If that would have been choppy water, it would have given off an entire different feeling to the photograph itself. It shows strength of the tree standing in the water by itself. I just love the look. It really gives a painterly look. People ask with shots like this, is it a painting? I get that a lot. I don't know if it's always a joke or if it's, people are being serious, but once you get into this level, it looks so abstract that it could pass as a painting. To see why people do paint them.
Can you pause for 1 minute?
Of course.
I just need to Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. So obviously, like I said, I haven't been doing this long, and I've had to conquer my own fears of going out early in the morning in blue hour into the woods by myself, going to locations, waterfalls, not being able to see, having headlamps on. I was very scared in the beginning to do that, and I will admit that. It's kind of one of those eerie feelings, even going out and shooting astro by yourself in locations where there's nobody. It can be a very surreal and weird feeling being out there, and I kind of had to push my boundaries in order to do that, and this was one of the first times that I was able to actually push myself, and you're going to do this. We were in Eau Claire, we were staying in Eau Claire when I drove out to Big Falls County Park, and it was an early sunrise. I had to be there by like 5:30 in the morning. And luckily, I actually know the park itself. I've been there during the day. I guess it would have been different if I would have had no knowledge of the way the park is, but it still was, it's such an experience. I recommend that to everybody who hasn't done that before, putting yourself in a situation like that where you're by yourself in a beautiful area like this, just watching the world come to life. It's amazing. You lose yourself. And I think I spent 3.5 hours there. I probably could have spent 7. I mean, it was very refreshing. As I've gotten a little bit more fluent with everything, I've gotten a little bit more braver and have been able to go out in different times, like throughout the middle of the night. I think a lot of astrophotographers get scared doing that just because public property, you're not allowed there overnight, so you're kind of always mumbling around. This is, again, one of my first ones. These are very, as you can see, I had movement in the flag, so there is a small imperfection in the photograph itself, but I enjoy mirror reflections like that, and you get that a lot. This might make you dizzy. This was an experiment that I was doing with Melissa at the fair, and I brought my 24 to 105 up there, and I was doing, I believe, half-second exposures, just trying to stay steady enough as I possibly could on a swing. And there was a couple that I was pretty darn, I caught my focus pretty darn good on the people, and it turned out well. But a lot of people get sick looking at it just from motion sickness. I mean, it makes sense. I get it. I believe this is one of my most iconic photos, just because that was probably one of the most pretty sunrises I've ever seen color-wise. It was just spectacular. But again, that's where I said I put myself into a lot of my photographs. So people know me even from my hat. People ask me, why do you have your hat on front? Because normally I always have my hat on backwards. So they get so processed in seeing my body shape and everything else. And my body looks, that they'll even know when something looks wrong. In this image, my hat was on going front, not backwards. And I remember that specifically. Again, this is a whole different idea. This is when I got a little bit better at spinning wool. Those beginning images were kind of when I first started, about 4 months into it. This was in the middle of winter in Fort Atkinson, in an abandoned factory area where they got a burnt out car. I mean, I looked for a very jagged area to do this in, where it kind of gave a grungy theme to it. And I mean, that's the fun thing about this, because you really have to compose that image before you get to that location. I had actually been envisioning this whole shot for probably 6 months before I actually did it. I had it in my head. I knew what it was going to look like. Originally, I was going to stand on top of the car, but the car was in such bad shape that I got there, I'm like, I'm not even going to attempt to try to do it. Something's going to break. So I didn't do that, so instead I got behind it. But it creates such a scene. I mean, it's a question maker too, where people who don't know photography, they look at something like that and think, what? Like, how did you do that? And I enjoy it. It's fun. Seeing the results after doing that spinning. This was another one. This one I actually got onto the hood of the car itself. I didn't get on top of the car, but I got on it, and I wanted to give the effect of the ring over the top of the car and this fire spinning over it. And if I made changes in it later and actually cropped in a little bit further to the car to get better detail, because I don't think I composed it properly. I probably should have set the camera tripod up maybe a good 4 or 5 feet in. But again, that's another example of what you can do. It's when you're just spinning it around in a circle this way, it's going to make a completely different effect than if you're spinning it around forward. So again, that's all experimentation and having fun. This has been one of my most iconic because of that movement. I mean, this was about 5.5 minutes, blue hour, right on the Rock River. I like those images. This was that same morning. You just get such strangulations of the clouds, and it gives such an abstract feel. I actually have this one printed and on my wall. It's one of my personal favorites. That one as well. That was not a calm day, but I enjoy that calm feel to Lake Koshkanon. A lot of people live out there, and I don't know if any of you know Lake Koshkanon. It's not the cleanest of lakes. It's kind of gross. Not much swimming. The Rock River pollutes all the way into it, so I mean, it's just anywhere you get into it by a boat landing, you sink down like 2.5 feet from all the silt that's brought in from the river. So making this lake beautiful has been a challenge of mine since I started shooting because it's so close to me. So that's what's fun about it for me, is shooting at sunrise and sunset, and you turn something that's viewed as ugly to so many people into something that's absolutely gorgeous. That's fun. Another thing, light painting, but this is in a different sense. You're just using a flashlight. And again, this is all about experimentation. I spin that around in a circle. And this was just with a cell phone flashlight. I mean, you can use anything from an actual flashlight to your cell phone to an LED bar.
You're spinning your cell phone around
in the
out by
middle,
the lake.
yeah, out by the lake. Somebody's probably out there like, what the hell is he doing? There's just things you do where people are probably so confused. I mean, I spun wool at that railroad bridge.
The long tunnel one?
The long tunnel bridge that's by New Glarus. There's a long bike path and it's got a very long train tunnel there. And I went in there in the middle of winter, and as soon as I was about to spin wool, DNR came up on me. And the tunnel was actually closed. You're not supposed to go through entry because in the winter it can get a lot of stalagmites, stalactites from the ice, so I know it's probably not safe structurally to go through. So I mean, I was only in like maybe 5 or 6 feet when I saw them coming up, but luckily I didn't do that. So we didn't spend very much time there. We went out there and just told her I was taking pictures, and again, but that was a thought-out shot that I had in my head. I was like, man, it would look cool if you could get the entire arc going around the entire tunnel. And sure, I got the shots. I got quite a few, but it's just we had to hurry and get out of there. So that, again, that was fun and an adventure. It turned into something that I think Melissa and I will remember for a long time just because it was goofy. Again, this was experimentation along with that flashlight using my light, and I called this teleportation. And I stood in each spot a little bit less than the next. That first spot was the first spot, and I kept on backing up and stayed in the first spot, I think, for 10 seconds, and then 5 seconds, and then 4 seconds, 3, 2, 1, and then I scurried off the actual building. So again, it's just using your imagination, composing that image in your head, seeing your composition in front of you appear or whatever. Try to picture in your head before you do it. A lot of these images, I see it before I actually put it onto the camera itself. This was quite an amazing morning. And again, when you're shooting sunrises like this in early blue hour, even when you want to have a realistic image, it's kind of difficult. Because I mean, this was, I believe, shot at f8, and I still had to shoot 15 seconds to properly expose the image. Because if I wanted to get the details from the clouds, I would have had to bust it up my ISO probably to 1600 to 3200, and then I lose all that quality of the image itself. So the only way to truly get that good quality is by shooting ISO 50 f8 and actually maintain it, but then it gives all the movement to the clouds and everything kind of looked messed up to me after I took it. I'm like, because there is a lot of texture to the clouds, but when you look closely at it, it's still kind of all blown. So I guess it just really depends on the sky itself, whether the image is going to turn out proper with long exposure in general. Like this one, I would have preferred having the texture of the sky because it would have gave more focal point. So, but again, it's a little bit different. This is a cityscape shot from Chicago. We stayed at a hotel, I think, on the 43rd floor, and I was messing with panoramics of the city itself. And if you can see, I had to put myself in the image too. And I believe this was a 6-photo panoramic vertical. I fell in love with that area too for photography. If you want to get into street lights and everything else, doing street work, Chicago was amazing. Milwaukee's really beautiful too, but Chicago, there just seems like there's just always something going on. Again, these big rocks, I tended to get on a kick of photographing the same thing over and over again, night after night. Melissa hates that, but I tend to do it and watch the water come up and come down, and Lake Koshkonong changes a lot, so you see the differences, and night to night, it's kind of cool in my opinion. So then I have a recollection of looking back, oh, lake was this high at this point. So now, at this point, the lake was high enough. Again, Chicago, this is a fun aspect of long exposure as well as doing street work, getting lights. All the shots that I normally do for night work like this is set at f22 and normally about 20 to 30 seconds. And that's where you're getting all the bursts and everything else, adding more interest to the scene itself. You just need a sturdy tripod, composed the shot itself, and I wanted this to be, this was actually, I think, a 4-shot panoramic to make it a vertical shot. Because I wanted you to be able to see from the ground level all the way to the sky. And it would have made the image a lot better if it would have been clear sky, but it was cloudy, so that's why it was completely dark. But I enjoy those type of photos too, they're fun. This was actually from the Milwaukee Art Museum. I was testing myself to shoot handheld long exposures because you have to shoot at low light in that facility itself. So I was trying to keep my ISO at ISO 50 to ISO 100. So at that point I was having to shoot at maybe a second. And these were actually focus pulls. So this was the giant steel dandelion. That's a very beautiful sculpture that's at the Milwaukee Art Museum. But I focus pulled from, I believe, 24 to 105, which gave that whole feeling to the entire image. So you can take an image and create an entirely different image. And I found that a lot of fun going to that art museum because you could create your own art from their art. That was my goal every single time I saw an exhibit. Well, I can turn this in creatively, artistically into something that I created. So that was pretty neat. I definitely recommend that. That was partial from that last image. I actually dragged that picnic table out into the water to take this shot. I had that in my mind too, and I didn't realize how heavy picnic tables were. Like ocean in the middle of, it was like 5 o'clock in the morning on the lakefront community. I'm sure everybody heard me. But I put it back. I got out there and put it back. But again, that was just an idea. I saw the picnic table and I was like, oh, well, that would be a fun thing to put into the water and actually still everything around it. Again, ideas. As you can see, like I said, I photographed that rock a lot, those 2 rocks. Kind of because I don't know what they are. They've been there since the early 70s, and there's metal beams coming out of one of them. I don't know if it was an old dock structure or something, but it's just crazy. You see in the winter, the ice shoves will actually push the rocks back into the shoreline, and then they'll come back out. I can guarantee those things have to weigh thousands of pounds, so that ice is just moving thousands of pounds of rocks. It's pretty impressive. Yeah, pictures of it in the winter. Favorite time, like I said, sunsets. You get such a beautiful scenes when you shoot long, long exposures. This was a 4.5 minute long exposure. There's a couple of them that I took. I remember they were about 4.5 minutes. And I just like the simplicity of it. There's nothing in the foreground that really draws you away from the color striations in the sky. I just love sunsets in the first place. And again, with those same rocks, as you can see the water level is going way down from where it was in the first place, and I think those are like weeks in between. Again, getting creative, actually getting into the water itself and shooting at f/22. A lot of people who shoot long exposures don't always recommend shooting into the sun itself while the sun's out. You kind of want the sun to be behind clouds. But occasionally I try to break that mold and shoot with the sun out at f/22, which will give that burst. And I position myself for it to burst on my shoulder, which that day that I did all this, I had waders on, and I probably had about 35 or 45 different positions of me and movements and everything else that I had planned in my head that I was going to do during that sunset. So again, that was exciting. Another great thing is capturing that movement of the water again. That's where you're shooting at half a second to a second sometimes. So a lot of the times you won't even necessarily need a tripod if you prop your camera on the ground on something and make sure it's stable. And I think for that shot, I put my tripod very, very low to the ground. I have it, so I use it. Same location as that last 4.5 minute one, but a different day. And Canon actually posted about this photo because of the movement of the clouds. So that was one of my moments where they shared it on Instagram, which was very big for me because I was just getting into photography, so any type of recognition from somebody like that, I kind of felt like I was going on the right path with what I was doing. And that is simple. Like I look at shots like this now from earlier, in what I was doing, and I bore myself. Now I know and understand landscape photography a little bit more, and I understand I need an interesting foreground to bring somebody into the middle ground and then into the background. Back then I kind of just went where I had to and tried to be as creative as I could in that situation. But Now I kind of think a little bit different. Same with this photo, you know. I looked at this photo originally, it's from Kohler Andre, it's right on Lake Michigan, but it really caught me off because it is a double exposure, it's an unintentional double exposure, it's movement in my tripod during the shot, but sometimes you can create something that you didn't intentionally create, and it creates something even kind of cooler. I thought it looked cooler to me. It gave kind of a iridescent backdrop to the entire backdrop itself, or to the tree line. It's different, but again, I guess everybody's got a different form of what they find beautiful and what they don't. Sometimes I find those double exposures and I'll still say, well, it's unique, it's not something you always see. Water tower, I did a lot of experimentation there for a while. I really love that structure in Milwaukee. I believe that was with a time stop in a minute and a half. So you can get some very unique backdrops to the sky for any buildings. It's fun with architectural shots too. Get a very interesting, Dorothy Carnes can create a very interesting scene at a barn or any type of landscape like this, but I really like the barn as the focal point. This is the bridge that's at the Discovery Zone in Milwaukee. And this was when I first got my 17-40 lens and 10 stop, and I was experimenting, and still one of my favorite shots to this day. I just love the coloring in it. I'm not always a blue guy, but this picture just stuck to me. And I've always wanted to go on a boat like that. I don't know if any of you have ever done that, but it's definitely been a dream to go on a sailboat someday. I'm actually heading back up to Canna Island in about a week and a half, but this was last year in August, and me and a group of people went up there to photograph Milky Way over the lighthouse itself, and we got blessed with the northern lights off the back end of the island, and it caught me off guard because it was my first time ever seeing the northern lights in general. I thought it would be a lot more brilliant for your eyes to see, which obviously our camera sensors pick up a lot more light than what our eyes do. I mean, it's a gentle white glow. I mean, you could see something was happening, I could see it happening, but once I put out a 20 to 30 second exposure, it's like my mouth dropped. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And once you get a little bit into it with stacking shots, astrophotography a lot of times will require it to get a clean image. A lot of times when I was up there, I was shooting all the way up to ISO 6400 in order to bring out that Milky Way core. And I didn't really understand stacking back then, but luckily when I was shooting the Aurora, I shot the same composition multiple times in the same spot. So I was able to stack images to create this one, which is the actual star trails. Which I did an actual star trail image from Canna Island, but that was a solid 19-minute exposure. So there's other ways about it. So you can do very long exposures, otherwise you can stack your 30-second exposures to create the trails itself. And that's Starry Landscape, I think it's called Starry Landscape Stacker, and you can get that if you have Mac. Otherwise it's called Sequator if you have PC. And this was done with Sequator. And I don't live in a very pure zone for light pollution. Obviously, southern Wisconsin, you pick up a lot of light pollution in general, but after stacking images, I was able to actually pick up the core pretty decent. I mean, I missed it, the main part of the core, but I was able to bring out enough details just by stacking the shot. So if you haven't ever done that, I would definitely recommend looking into it, because your astrophotography will go up a whole nother level once you learn how to actually stack those images together. I'm stuck. There we go. Is that my last image?
Last one, probably.
It might be. Let's see. It is. That's my last one, guys. I had some things, obviously tips that I wanted to tell you quick. Let's see here. Long exposure photography is a technique that produces stunning effects and dramatic moods even when you shoot at night. I like shooting at night with clouds because you're going to get the stringulations of the clouds themselves in the sky along with the stars. It becomes very neat to do. It works best though for anything landscape. That's my opinion. I mean, you can do it for street and cityscapes and stuff like that. The landscape photography definitely is the best form to use long exposure. First major tip is avoiding vibration no matter what. Be careful and conscientious of that when you're shooting, and always use a sturdy tripod. Second is be mindful of the weather. Before you go to a certain location, always be mindful. Be searching days ahead of time to make sure that the clouds are looking right, that you're not having just a clear day. Obviously, you're not going to go out shooting long exposure with no clouds. It's not going to turn out that well. So monitor that. I always recommend AccuWeather. You can usually look up to 90 days in advance on AccuWeather. It gives you a pretty good idea. Also, inspect the location that you want to shoot at days before you go. Get an idea in your head the composition you want to go for. Don't be afraid to go out and explore without your camera first, and then come back with your camera after you have an idea to use on that specific location. Always be scouting. Coming into visualizing and composing your photo in your head before you go to that location itself. Always keep that in your mind and kind of lock that into place before you get there. Biggest thing too for cameras that aren't like mine, a mirrorless, you don't have the EVF display in mind. I can put my 10-stop filter on and my sensor will see through that 10-stop and I'll still be able to focus. A lot of the times if you put a screw-on filter on your camera, you're going to have to take that filter off to be able to focus to infinity first, then put the filter back on just so that you have the focus correct. Otherwise, you're going to be having difficulties. So I always recommend take the filter off first, do your focusing first, and then put that filter back on and you can focus. Especially for astrophotography, because you're always focusing to infinity with that, and that's helpful if you've got a marking on your lens too. Always pay attention to the light. That's huge, especially in the mornings too. Even if you have a 10-stopper on, I mean, I'll be shooting like a minute long. The sun will come out for 2-3 seconds throughout the clouds. That entire part of that image is going to be overexposed, and I'm going to have to toss that image immediately. It's as easy as that. So that's all pretty much by luck of draw. You just take the same 30-second shot and you're going to get a different result. And then I always recommend doing test shots first, and then there's a calculator. There's an app you can get on your phone called Photo Pills. I definitely recommend that app to anybody. It has calculators for how long of exposure times you need. If you have a 10-stop, a 16-stop, or a 5-stop, you take your normal exposure, you know, at 1/150th of a second at f4, and you calculate that into there, and it turns into like a minute-and-a-half long exposure, and you get a properly exposed shot every time. I mean, that's not if you're not good at doing math. There are calculations you can do too, but it is a lot easier, at least for me, on the go.
What's the name of that app?
It's Photo Pills. Photo Pills.
Okay.
And you can get that on any of the app markets, the Android or the iPhone markets. A lot of people use it. It also gives you direct virtual reality to where the Milky Way is and where the sun rises and the sun sets no matter what location you're at. So if you're trying to figure out where the sun's going to set when you're on vacation or something like that, you're going to have that tool book right on you, which is, I use it a lot whenever I go someplace. ND filters obviously are the most important part of long exposure photography, and there's a lot of cheap ones out there that actually do a quality job that I do recommend. Ice Filters is a really good company. I have heard nothing but good things, and you can get a good screw-on filter for ice for only $25, $30. I mean, if you get into it enough to where you want to get a filter system, you're looking at good money for it, but the results are going to be better because it's better quality glass, obviously. Any sort of glass between your sensor and your lens is never a good thing, and I've learned that as I've gotten a little bit more into it. But color cast, you have to worry about vignetting with those filters too, but like I said, with ice, you really don't have to worry about it. There's not even a blue tint to it. And if you do get a filter system, Nicey is really good, and Lee Filters is a very well-known filter system. Other than that, it's then just taking a shot, experimenting, and trying to use your creativity to come up with something new and exciting. And I think that's the best part about any type of photography, is just being able to use your brain to come up with something new. Especially with having social media, we see everybody's work 24/7, so we definitely have a lot of inspiration. I think that's a big thing nowadays. We can inspire each other. That's why I like Facebook groups. That's why I was so surprised you're not on Facebook. You're missing out. You miss out seeing a lot of people, though. You get a lot of inspiration from people from Wisconsin. We've got a very great photographers community, I think, in our state. Other than that, do we have any questions? Yes.
I was wondering if you ever use your sensor on any of these shots to gauge what your exposure is going to be.
Well, I mean, normally when I'm shooting these long exposures, I'm looking at the EVF. I mean, I normally don't have to rely on that in general, just for the fact that I have a calculator right off the get-go that I know how long the exposure to take. Again, that's really experimentation. I mean, I'll think sometimes that I can shoot at f/22 for a minute and I blow an image out horribly. And then so I make that mistake. I know I'm gonna have to draw that exposure back at least somewhat, maybe 20 seconds and then pull it back. So a lot of the times it's more experimenting. That's where they say test your shot first and then know you got that exposure level correct. And then if that first one's not correct, you just keep on adjusting. So I mean, it's all adjustment based. I'll follow my tools, but at the same time, it's difficult when you're shooting 4 or 5 minutes. You're not going to have that same.
You're wasting time.
Yeah.
And the time goes by and you lose it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That becomes issues. So that's where a timer comes in handy too, and that PhotoPills actually has a timer. I'm lucky. I don't need a remote release. A lot of cameras, you're going to need a release for your shutter. And mine, I can just click this screen. It starts the exposure. When I'm done with the exposure, I click the screen again. It's simple. Not everybody has bulb mode either, and not all cameras have bulb mode. And if you're wanting to do extremely long exposures, you absolutely need bulb mode. Otherwise, the longest exposure you're going to be able to do is 30 seconds. So I mean, it just really kind of depends on what you want to do. Anybody else?